I've had people crying their eyes out. I've had guys call me a I mean, I've had so many people that when I tell them, like, no, your stuff is fake, start cussing me out because this is real. I'm going like, why would I tell you it's fake if it's not fake?
For years, Pawn Stars showed Rick Harrison as calm, sharp, and always in control. But behind the counter, patience was often pushed to the limit. Now, Rick finally reveals the truth about 6 customers who turned routine deals into unforgettable standoffs. These weren't simple negotiations, they were clashes fueled by ego, wild expectations, and stubborn belief. One customer walked in, convinced a single item was worth a jaw-dropping 6 figures, and the tension never recovered. What happened next reshaped how Rick handled the rest, and not everyone left smiling. The overpriced Texan currency collector. If there's one type of customer that consistently pushes Rick Harrison's patience to the limit, it's the seller who walks in already convinced they're sitting on a small fortune, no matter what the facts say. And few moments on Pawn Stars captured that tension better than the infamous encounter with the Texan currency collector, whose expectations were measured not in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The seller entered the world-famous gold and silver pawn shop with an air of absolute confidence. In his hands were several pieces of historical paper currency, 9 Republic of Texas notes, and 1 Government of Texas bill, all dating back to the mid-1800s. To the average person, they looked like old, fragile scraps of paper. But to this collector, they represented what he believed was a once-in-a-lifetime payday. Right out of the gate, the seller made his expectations crystal clear. He wanted $25,000 for the 9 Republic of Texas notes, already a stretch. But the real jaw-dropper came next. For the single Government of Texas bill, he demanded an astonishing $650,000. Rick, who has handled everything from Roman coins to rare Civil War artifacts, didn't laugh, but his face said everything. He immediately recognized 2 problems: niche market demand and extreme overvaluation. Yes, early Texas currency is historically fascinating. Yes, it's collectible. But history alone doesn't automatically translate into massive market value. As always, Rick did what he does best. He called in an expert. When the currency specialist arrived, the tone of the conversation began to shift. The expert examined each bill carefully, explaining that while Republic of Texas notes are desirable to a small group of collectors, they are far from rare. Condition also played a major role. Folds, wear, and overall preservation significantly reduced their value. The verdict wasn't kind to the seller's expectations. Most of the Republic notes were appraised at just a few $100s each, with one reaching closer to $2,000 due to slightly better condition. As for the coveted Government of Texas bill, rare, yes, but nowhere near 6-figure territory. The expert made it clear there was simply no realistic market that justified a $650,000 price tag. That's when the tension boiled over. Rather than lowering his expectations, the vendor strengthened his position. He disregarded the appraisal, questioned the authority of the expert, and directly attacked Rick for not grasping the worth of what he was being shown. After the seller had left the shop without a transaction, he later publicly criticized both Rick and the expert, saying that they didn't have any idea of the real value of the currency. For Rick, this was not merely a failed negotiation. It was a classic case of one of the most annoying customer types in the pawn industry, the seller who equates personal faith with market reality. Rick has often remarked that pawn shops are neither museums nor auction houses. Every item he buys must go through resale, which very often takes months or even years for the right buyer to arrive. The market for niche collectibles like the early Texas currency is so small that it dramatically shortens the pool of potential buyers, which in turn raises the risk. And in Rick's world, risk is directly proportional to price. The main thing that made this confrontation so irritating was the refusal to listen rather than the seller's enthusiasm, which Rick values. A situation where one person believes strongly that he is right and all experts are wrong makes it impossible to reach an agreement through negotiations. Eventually, the transaction did not take place. The currency left the store in the same condition it was brought in, and Rick was left with disbelief, not because the items were not interesting, but because the seller's expectations were so far removed from reality. Rick sometimes uses the phrase that he can't stand certain customers, and this moment is the perfect example. It is not arrogance, it is not greed, it is the inability to understand that the price is not set according to what you want. In this case, $650,000 dreams were never going to survive a reality check at the pawn counter. That moment was hard to watch, but the next one makes it even harder to believe. The witless Ottoman-era seller. Another customer type that has clearly tested Rick Harrison's patience over the years is the seller who believes age alone guarantees a massive payday. One of the clearest examples of this mindset appeared when a seller walked into the pawn shop armed with what he believed were priceless relics from the Ottoman Empire, and an expectation that Rick would immediately open his wallet wide. The seller presented two items: an Ottoman-era dagger and an old flintlock pistol, both allegedly dating back several centuries. He spoke confidently, leaning heavily on the item's age and historical origin. To him, Ottoman Empire automatically translated to rarity, prestige, and a huge payout. In his mind, these weren't just antiques, they were museum-worthy artifacts. Rick, however, has learned through decades in the business that history is only half the equation. Right away, Rick examined the items and noticed potential red flags. While the dagger certainly looked old, its condition raised concerns. The blade showed signs of heavy wear, chipping, and poor preservation. The flintlock pistol, though visually impressive, appeared to be a fairly common style produced in large quantities during its era. Still, Rick didn't jump to conclusions. As always, he called in an expert to verify authenticity, age, and, most importantly, market value. When the expert arrived, the fantasy began to unravel. Yes, the dagger was authentic and dates back to the Ottoman period, but the expert quickly explained that condition is everything in the antique weapons market. Collectors want clean lines, intact blades, and minimal restoration. This dagger, while old, had suffered too much damage over time. As a result, its value dropped significantly. Then came the flintlock pistol, the item the seller seemed most proud of. The expert confirmed it was genuine, but added a crucial detail the seller hadn't considered. It wasn't rare. Similar flintlocks had been produced by the thousands, and many survived in better condition. Age alone didn't make it special, and collectors already had plenty of options. The final appraisal landed far below what the seller expected. The seller's reaction was immediate and defensive. Instead of asking questions or reassessing his expectations, he dismissed the expert's opinion outright. He insisted the items were far more valuable, and implied that both Rick and the expert were undervaluing history itself. Rick attempted to shed light on the true state of affairs. A pawn shop must always think about its resale, the demand of the buyers, and the time factor. The age of an item can be 300 years, and it can still be hard to sell if the market is flooded or the condition is bad. However, the seller was not concerned about the truth. He just wanted to be validated. The discussions came to a standstill very quickly. Rick was decisive in that his offer was dependent solely on the appraiser's evaluation. The seller, determined to keep his over-the-top expectation, turned down Rick's proposition and completed his withdrawal of the goods. For Rick, this meeting was not the one that made him go through hostility or drama. Rather, it was the one that left him reconsidering people's tenacity. This is the type of consumer Rick usually finds to be the most tiring. A person who asks for a professional opinion and then totally disregards it when the response does not match their belief. Rick has put it bluntly that a lot of sellers come in with a hope to hear a particular number, but not the truth. And when the truth does not match that number, they conclude the system is broken instead of their expectation being the case. What made this interaction very disappointing was that the seller really did have some good antique pieces. If he had the right mindset, there would have been a deal. But he refused to see value as something that could change and be driven by the market. Instead, he looked at it as a fixed sum, determined only by age and origin. As a result, the Ottoman dagger and flintlock pistol remained unsold in the shop, not because Rick was not interested in them, but because the seller could not accept their real worth. This incident points out one of the main things Rick has learned from his experience in the pawn industry. High hopes do not always lead to good outcomes. Without the ability to bend, having only the knowledge and being willing to listen, no matter how interesting the items may be, can result in a deadlock. And for Rick Harrison, such customers do not just consume time, they represent to the fullest the contrast between the idealized history and the hard, unyielding reality of the market. The horn haggler. If there's one thing Rick Harrison has mastered over the years, it's knowing when a negotiation is truly over and when it's just beginning. Some customers walk out because the deal is dead. Others leave because emotions get the best of them. And then there are sellers like the infamous horn haggler, whose dramatic exit wasn't a final decision at all, but a calculated move that nearly cost him the deal entirely. The seller walked into the shop carrying what he believed was a rare antique powder horn, a curved container traditionally used to store gunpowder during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Powder horns can be valuable, especially when they feature detailed engravings, military connections, or links to notable historical figures. This seller was convinced his horn checked enough boxes to be worth serious money. From the moment the conversation began, his expectations were sky high. He confidently suggested the horn could be worth $3,000 or more, pointing to its age, craftsmanship, and overall condition as proof. He spoke with certainty, as though the number itself was non-negotiable. Rick listened patiently, examined the horn, and immediately recognized the reality. While the piece was authentic and historically interesting, it wasn't nearly as rare or exceptional as the seller believed. Still, Rick followed his usual process and called in an expert. The expert carefully evaluated the horn and confirmed that it was genuine, dating back to the correct period. But then came the inconvenient truth. Powder horns were produced in large quantities, and unless they featured distinctive engravings, documented ownership, or direct ties to a specific historical event, their value remained limited. This horn, while old, lacked the unique characteristics that drive prices into the thousands. The appraisal landed well below the seller's expectations. Rick made his offer based on resale potential, auction data, and risk. He came in under $1,600, a fair number by market standards, but one that instantly offended the seller. The reaction was immediate. The seller scoffed, shook his head, and accused Rick of lowballing an item he felt deserved far more respect. That's when the negotiation turned emotional. Instead of countering with a realistic number, the seller took it personally. He insisted the horn was undervalued and suggested Rick simply didn't understand its importance. Rick calmly explained his position. The shop had to consider buyer demand, how long the item might sit unsold, and the margin needed to justify the purchase after fees and time. But logic wasn't getting through. Frustrated, the seller made what he thought was a power move. He gathered his horn, declared that he knew what he had, and headed for the door. It was a classic pawn shop bluff, the belief that walking away would force Rick to chase him, raise the offer, or reconsider the price. Rick didn't react. He didn't call out. He didn't counter. He didn't move. Years in the business had taught Rick that chasing sellers almost always leads to overpaying. If a deal made sense, he'd stand by it. If it didn't, he was perfectly fine letting it go. To Rick, patience wasn't passive, it was strategic. That's when something unexpected happened. As the seller lingered near the exit, clearly hoping for a reaction, Corey Harrison stepped in. Acting as a mediator, Corey re-engaged the seller with a calmer tone. He acknowledged the horn's history and craftsmanship while gently steering the conversation back toward market reality. Corey suggested that meeting somewhere closer to the middle could still make the deal worthwhile. The seller hesitated. The confidence faded. The dramatic exit lost its momentum. Slowly, It became clear that Rick wasn't going to cave, but the door to a deal wasn't completely closed either. Eventually, the seller returned to the counter. After more back and forth, both sides adjusted their positions and landed on a price near the midpoint. It wasn't the number the seller originally wanted, but it was far better than walking away with nothing. The deal was finalized. For Rick, this encounter summed up one of the most exhausting behaviors he encounters in the pawn business. Sellers who say no, not because negotiations are over, but because they're fishing for a reaction. When no becomes a tactic instead of a decision, negotiations turn into emotional chess matches. Rick doesn't dislike haggling, it's part of the job. What he dislikes is when drama replaces logic. In the end, the horn haggler learned a valuable lesson. Walking away only works if the other person needs the deal more than you do. And in Rick Harrison's pawn shop, calculated patience always beats theatrical exits. If that exit felt dramatic, brace yourself. The next encounter pushes patience to the breaking point. The unrealistic price giver. If Rick Harrison had to name the single customer type that causes the most headaches in the pawn business, it wouldn't be the loudest, the angriest, or even the most dramatic. It would be the unrealistic price giver. The seller who walks in convinced their item is worth full retail, auction house money, or even more, with absolutely no regard for risk, resale, or reality. This type of customer doesn't represent one person. They represent hundreds. They come through the doors every day carrying paintings, collectibles, weapons, memorabilia, or antiques they believe are worth tens of thousands of dollars. And they all start the conversation the same way. I know what I've got. Rick has heard that phrase so many times it's practically background noise. The problem isn't confidence. Rick respects confidence. The problem is that these sellers confuse asking price with market value, and market value with personal attachment. They've done a quick online search, glanced at a high listing price, or heard a story from a friend, and suddenly they're experts. One classic scenario plays out again and again. A seller brings in a painting they believe is worth $50,000. Rick calls in an expert who confirms it's authentic, but not rare. Comparable pieces have sold for $2,000 to $3,000 at auction. Rick explains the numbers, the fees, the time it could sit unsold, and the risk involved. The seller doesn't hear any of it. To give none other than the highest number ever seen linked to something alike. They were fixated on the very number along with the same objection to the expert's view and the proposition of someone else being the one to pay more. Definitely. Angry, some of them left. Others were giving Rick a hard time and talking about how pawn shops rip people off. The whole situation was viewed by Rick as a nightmare. Unlike retail shops, pawn shops do not work the same way. They do not offer the full price. Rather, they buy at a level where the resale, market fluctuation, and loss can be accommodated. A month after opening, the shop would probably close down if Rick paid retail value for everything. This is the fact of life that most of the unrealistic price givers simply refuse to accept. The unreasonably high-priced customers are even more annoying because of their selective listening. They ask for the expert opinions, and then they ignore those opinions when the numbers are not in their favor. They seek validation, not evaluation. Rick has mentioned that there are times when sellers don't really want a deal, but they want confirmation that they are right. And when they are not confirmed, they take the negotiation as a personal insult. Another common issue is emotional pricing. An item belonged to a grandfather. It's been in the family for decades. It has sentimental value, which is understandable, but irrelevant to the market price. Rick often explains that buyers don't pay extra for memories. They pay for condition, demand, and authenticity. These negotiations usually end the same way. No deal. Rick lets the seller go, knowing that sooner or later the truth will come out. Some people return after weeks, having received the same offers from other dealers. Others do not return at all, still believing that their item is of great value. What the audience sometimes perceives as stubbornness is actually a matter of principle. Rick can't say no to people. But paying too much for unrealistic items is not only damaging for the business, but also a disrespect for the market itself. This type of customer perfectly illustrates why Rick cannot tolerate certain negotiations, not because of their attitude, but due to their denial. When someone does not want to accept the truth, then negotiation is out of the question. In the pawn business, value is not emotional, theoretical, or hopeful. It is practical. And for Rick Harrison, the unrealistic price giver will always be the hardest customer to handle. Not because they bring bad items, but because they bring bad expectations. The Faberge wishful thinker. Not every difficult customer on Pawn Stars was difficult because they were rude, stubborn, or wildly unrealistic. Some of the most memorable encounters came from a very different place: simple unawareness. And in one of the most surprising moments Rick Harrison has ever shared, a quiet, modest request turned into a 5-figure payout, proving that honesty, when practiced deliberately, can matter more than aggressive negotiation. The seller in this story was a woman who walked into the shop carrying a small, elegant brooch. There was nothing flashy about it. No oversized gemstones, no bold branding, no obvious markers that screamed wealth or prestige. It didn't look like something you'd expect to spark excitement in a pawn shop known for rare artifacts and high-stakes deals. To her, it was just jewelry. She explained that she was hoping to get around $2,000 for it, an amount that felt reasonable, even modest. She wasn't pushing for top dollar. She wasn't trying to negotiate aggressively. She simply wanted a fair deal and assumed the brooch was worth roughly what it looked like. For Rick, that low expectation immediately raised curiosity. Rick has often said that when a seller comes in asking for a surprisingly reasonable number, it's usually worth slowing down. Overconfidence often hides disappointment, but humility sometimes hides something valuable. As Rick examined the brooch more closely, subtle details began to stand out: precise craftsmanship, refined materials, and a level of care that suggested it wasn't mass-produced. Something about it didn't fit the $2,000 story. Instead of rushing into an offer or trying to negotiate the price down, Rick made a choice that surprised both the seller and viewers. He paused the deal. He took his time. This wasn't a negotiation problem, it was an identification problem. Rick soon realized that the brooch wasn't simply antique jewelry. It had the unmistakable traits of a Faberge piece, an elite category of collectible art associated with luxury, European royalty, and some of the most meticulously crafted objects in history. Faberge items are rare, heavily documented, and fiercely pursued by serious collectors worldwide. In simple terms, this wasn't a $2,000 brooch. Once Rick confirmed what he was looking at, the true value came into focus. The brooch was worth closer to $15,000, more than 7 times what the seller had asked for. This is the moment where the story could have gone in a very different direction. Rick could have said nothing. He could have paid the $2,000 and walked away with a massive profit. Many pawn shops would have, but Rick didn't do that. Instead, he did something that sharply contrasts with the stereotype of a ruthless pawnbroker. He told her the truth. Rick explained what the brooch actually was, why it carried such value, and what it could realistically sell for on the open market. Then, rather than sticking to her original request, he paid her the full $15,000, the fair market value. For Rick, this wasn't generosity, it was a principle. In interviews, Rick has repeatedly explained that trust is one of the most valuable currencies in the pawn business. Short-term wins gained through deception cost far more in the long run. Reputation, integrity, and fairness are what keep customers coming back, and what separate a business from a hustle. Ironically, this encounter is included among the customers Rick couldn't stand, not because of conflict, but because of what it represented. The seller did nothing wrong, but her lack of awareness highlighted how vulnerable people can be when they don't know what they own. In the wrong shop, she could have walked out with a fraction of what her item was worth. Rick has admitted that moments like this stay with him. They underscore how many people walk into pawn shops every day carrying valuables they don't fully understand. And while Rick chose to do the right thing, he knows not everyone would. In the end, the seller didn't leave disappointed. She left stunned. What began as a $2,000 hope became a $15,000 reality, not because of negotiation skill, but because honesty stepped in at the right moment. This story remains one of the clearest examples of Rick Harrison's philosophy in action. Fair deals build lasting credibility, and while wishful thinking often leads to disappointment, sometimes it leads to something far better, when the right person is standing on the other side of the counter. For Rick Harrison, it was proof that doing right by people isn't just good ethics, it's good business. That was surprising, but the next encounter forces Rick to draw a hard line, and not everyone sees it coming. The bluff that didn't work. Some customers walk into the pawn shop believing negotiation is a high-stakes poker game. The strategy is always the same: bluff hard, hold your ground, and wait for the other side to fold. But as Rick Harrison has learned over decades behind the counter, that mindset doesn't just fail. It often backfires spectacularly. One particular encounter turned what should have been a straightforward deal into a drawn-out standoff. And in the end, the seller still lost the bet he was so sure he'd win. The seller arrived with a vintage rock and roll gambling machine, a flashy mechanical piece designed to mix entertainment with chance. It was visually striking: polished chrome, bold lettering, and a nostalgic charm that immediately caught the eye. The seller clearly believed the machine's appearance alone justified a hefty payout, and he walked in confident that Rick would see the same dollar signs he did. Right from the start, the seller set the tone by anchoring the price at $4,000. He argued that the machine's age, uniqueness, and visual appeal made it a rare collectible. To him, the value was obvious and non-negotiable. Rick, however, approached the situation with his usual caution. Gambling machines are notoriously risky investments for pawn shops. They're large, heavy, expensive to restore, and difficult to transport. On top of that, they appeal to a very limited group of buyers. Storage alone can become a long-term expense if the item doesn't sell quickly. In pawn shop terms, all of that adds up to one thing: risk. Rick examined the machine carefully and acknowledged that it had appeal. He didn't dismiss it outright, but he also pointed out the practical downsides: possible mechanical issues, the cost of refurbishment, limited demand, and the reality that it could sit unsold for months. To ground the discussion in reality, Rick relied on what he always trusts most: market comparisons and experience. Based on similar machines that had sold in the past and what he believed the shop could realistically resell it for, Rick made his offer: $2,700. For most sellers, that would have been a reasonable counter. But this seller wasn't interested in flexibility. He came back with a counter-offer of $2,750, a difference of just $50, and treated it like a hard line. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about principle. What followed was an awkward and tense standoff. Rick stood his ground and explained that while $50 might not matter to the seller, it did matter to the shop's margins. Pawn shops operate on numbers, not emotions. The seller, however, saw the negotiation as a test of will. To him, conceding $50 felt like losing the battle entirely. After several minutes of back and forth, the seller made a bold move. He grabbed the machine and walked out, convinced that Rick would call him back or regret letting the deal slip away. It was a classic bluff, one Rick had seen countless times before. Rick didn't react. For Rick, walking away from a deal is often the smartest decision. Even a small overpayment can create a bad precedent. If the math doesn't work, it doesn't work, and no amount of stubbornness can change that. Rick was perfectly comfortable letting the deal go. What the seller didn't account for was reality setting in. Not long after leaving the shop, the situation changed. According to the show, the seller's wife stepped in, pointing out what Rick had already made clear. The offer was fair. Turning down $2,700 over $50 wasn't a power move. It was irrational. Soon enough, the seller returned. This time, the bravado was gone. The poker face had vanished. He came back ready to accept Rick's original offer. Rick, calm and unmoved, agreed to the deal exactly as he had before. $2,700. Take it or leave it. The handshake was quick. The deal was done. For Rick, this encounter perfectly captured why some customers are so exhausting. Not because they're rude or dishonest, but because they let ego override logic. Negotiation isn't about winning every dollar. It's about understanding limits and recognizing when a deal is already fair. The seller treated the pawn shop like a casino table, betting that Rick would crack under pressure. But pawn negotiations don't reward bluffs. They reward realism. In the end, the seller didn't walk away with more money. He walked away with the same offer he had all along, minus time, pride, and leverage. And for Rick Harrison, it was just another reminder that in the pawn business, the house doesn't gamble, it calculates. In the end, these unforgettable customers proved that in Rick Harrison's world, value always beats ego. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, drop a comment with the craziest Pawn Stars deal you remember. Subscribe for more insider stories, and click the next video on your screen to keep the action rolling.